A warm welcome to the very first Asia-Pacific launch of the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Gerard Vinluan, and I'm the Asia-Pacific Director of the World Justice Project, and I will be your host for today's event. And we have a great program ahead. But first, let me turn to Elizabeth Anderson, the Executive Director of the World Justice Project, for a word of welcome. Betsy, please.
Thank you, Gerard, and welcome to the Asia-Pacific launch of the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index 2021. Thank you for joining us today, and let me begin with a special thank you to the Honorable the Chief Justice of Singapore, Sundaresh Menon, who will be delivering his keynote remarks momentarily. Thanks too to our distinguished panel of speakers who will join my colleague, Dr. Alejandro Ponce, in discussion of the latest Rule of Law Index findings and their implications for the Asia-Pacific region. Many of you are quite familiar with the work of the World Justice Project, but for some of those of you who are joining for the first time, let me say a few words about our work. The World Justice Project's mission is to create knowledge, build awareness, and stimulate action to advance the rule of law. At the heart of this work is the type of data collection you will hear about tonight, to gather insights about how the rule of law and governance are experienced in practice in our everyday lives, and to bring this evidence base to bear on contemporary policymaking that strengthens the rule of law. We do this work in close collaboration with colleagues around the world, and since 2016, we have been pleased to maintain a Singapore-based Asia-Pacific program that works across the region to share our research and data with a broad spectrum of stakeholders from government, business, law, education, and civil society, and to work together to strengthen the rule of law. We do this work because we believe that the rule of law is foundational to so much else that we are trying to achieve in this world, essential to the building of successful communities that deliver justice, opportunity, and peace. The data you will hear about shortly underscore the rule of law challenges before us. Many of the trends are headed in the wrong direction. Reversing those trends will require concerted effort by all of us. While this is a daunting challenge, we find hope in your interest in and your commitment to this cause. We thank you for it, and we look forward to future collaboration in building more just communities. With that, let me turn back to WJP Asia Director Gerard Vinluan to guide you through today's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy, for the very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us from many parts of the Asia-Pacific region and much farther afield right now. It is now my privilege and honor to invite the Honorable the Chief Justice of Singapore, Sundaresh Menon, to deliver the keynote remarks. Chief Justice, please.
Warm greetings to all of you, and congratulations to the World Justice Project on the launch of the Rule of Law Index 2021. Over the years, the Rule of Law Index, now in its 12th edition, has established itself as a trusted source of data on the rule of law. The index currently covers 139 countries and offers a longitudinal overview of how the commitment to the rule of law at the national, regional, and global levels has evolved over time. The simplicity and clarity with which the data is presented belies the tremendous work that goes into collecting and processing it. I understand that this year's index distills data from, amongst other sources, surveys of not less than 138,000 households and around 4,200 legal practitioners and legal experts. This is a truly monumental effort, and it is all the more impressive given that it was undertaken despite the challenges posed by the pandemic. The rule of law has at various times been taken to mean different things to different people. But even recognizing the scope for disagreements over the precise content of the rule of law, most would agree that the rule of law comprehends at least a shared societal commitment to its values and core principles, such as accessibility, accountability, transparency, and the principle that the exercise of public authority must be subject to legal limits. For the rule of law to exist meaningfully in a society, the governed and those who govern must be equally committed to these values encompassed by the rule of law. And they must take it for granted that the rule of law is a necessary element for the proper functioning of society. On this view, the rule of law resides not in a collection of rules and laws, but rather in the shared belief that the law should rule. This belief manifests in the countless microtransactions that people undertake in the shadow of the law in the humdrum of daily life, such as when a motorist stops at a traffic light, or a merchant honors a contract, or a policeman decides not to force an entry without a warrant. In this way, public commitment to the rule of law is reinforced as legal actors live up to their legal obligations. Seen in this light, the best evidence for the rule of law exists in society that lives in that way. As Professor Murray Hunt, director of the Bingham Center for the Rule of Law, quite aptly puts it, the rule of law is a living and breathing culture, a habit and state of mind instantiated by public participation. It follows that the true measure of a society's adherence to the rule of law will be found not in the grandeur of its courthouses, the sophistication of its statute books, or even the reputation and standing of its judges. Rather, one should look within a society to gauge how the rule of law is actually experienced and perceived by its members. This is what the Rule of Law Index endeavors to do, by relying on surveys to gain some insight into the lived experience of the respondents, even if this is shaped by their perspectives. To that extent, it serves as an important guide to societal attitudes and commitment to the rule of law. The picture that the index paints this year is one of the rule of law somewhat in retreat. For the fourth consecutive year, more countries have declined than improved in their overall rule of law performance, and national scores for several categories, including timeliness of justice and absence of discrimination, have seen some sharp declines. These trends also seem broad and persistent. Countries which saw declining or stagnant scores outnumbered those which saw improvement across all regions of the world and all income groups. And a majority of those which had experienced a decline in 2020 had also seen a deterioration in their scores in the previous year. This should concern us. If the decline in the commitment to the rule of law is eroded, it will tell in societal life. When our trust and belief in the rule of law is eroded, the impact can be grave and can manifest rapidly. And the danger is that unlike a building which can be repaired or a statute which can be amended or reenacted, public trust in the law and its institutions, once lost, can be difficult to restore. Public trust in the law and its institution is often seen as a casualty of the overall decline of the rule of law. But I suggest that that loss of trust might also be a cause of that decline. If the rule of law is brought to life by public commitment to and belief in its values, then its existence depends on there being a substratum of public trust and confidence in the justice system. I want to touch on two widespread challenges which threaten to undermine that substratum of trust and confidence. First, rising inequality, and second, the breakdown of truth in public discourse. Dealing first with rising inequality. While the global economy has been on an upward trajectory for some time, various studies note that the gains have not been evenly distributed, and that the benefits of global growth have disproportionately accrued to the rich. According to the 2018 World Inequality Report, between 1980 and 2016, the top 1% of global earners captured twice as much of the growth in global income as the poorest 50%. Of course, some measure of inequality is to be expected in any meritocratic society, since there will always be differences in ability and circumstance. But extreme and entrenched inequality can bring about feelings of division, exclusion, and a growing sense of hopelessness fueled by the view that one's future is largely determined by one's background. The law should, in theory, operate as a bulwark against inequality. It is, after all, a fundamental principle of the rule of law that all are equal before the law. But there seems a growing sense that the law and its institutions often do not live up to that ideal. A substantial part of this can be traced to inequalities in access to justice. In 2017, a staggering 86% of civil legal problems reported by low-income Americans received inadequate or no legal assistance. And in 2019, the World Justice Project's report on measuring the justice gap estimated that nearly 1.4 billion people were unable to obtain justice for a host of civil legal problems, ranging from disputes over land to matrimonial and employment disputes. Legal rights are worthless until and unless there exist accessible and efficient means by which they may be claimed and vindicated. Another issue of concern pertains to the incidence of what appears to be the discriminatory enforcement of the law along a range of societal fault lines, whether racial, religious, or socioeconomic. In the United States, several high-profile incidents of police violence against persons of color have sparked concerns of discriminatory policing practice. Last year, one report on police shootings in the US found that amongst unarmed victims of such shootings, African Americans were killed at nearly 3 times the rate of white Americans. Such outcomes are often deeply intertwined with economic factors. One study found that America's poorest neighborhoods are also the most likely to see deadly police encounters. Plainly, these feelings of exclusion and discrimination can adversely affect public trust and confidence in the justice system, and by extension, in the rule of law. Each year, the Edelman Trust Barometer surveys public trust in government, business, and the media, among other institutions. Its 2020 report found that 57% of those who indicated distrust of governments did so because they felt that governments serve the interests of only the few. Well, one might be tempted to dismiss these as somewhat abstract feelings of dissatisfaction and unfairness. They seem symptomatic of a deeper distrust of institutions of authority, arising from the perception that the system, including the justice system, has been co-opted by the elite in society at the expense of the regular citizenry, and worse, of minorities. Let me turn to the second related challenge to public trust and confidence in the rule of law, which is what has been referred to as truth decay. Trust in almost all sources of facts and information, from the government to the mainstream media and even social media, has fallen to new lows. 64% of Americans say they find it difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction when listening to elected officials. And just 35% of respondents to a 2021 survey trusted social media as a source of news, while 59% believed that journalists deliberately aim to mislead people by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. We have never had more information, but at the same time, we have a dearth of objectively verifiable, trusted facts. And this has driven the alarming rise of alternative facts, echo chambers, and consequently a decline in the role of facts and truth in public discourse. This should be of great concern to us, not least because of the effect that falsehoods or even inadvertent inaccuracies can have on the administration of justice. In the Miller case in the United Kingdom, which concerned the constitutional limitations on the government's power to effect Brexit, the judges involved were branded enemies of the people by the tabloid media, with subsequent commentary accusing them of straying into political territory, even though, as the judgment itself clearly stated, the parties had all agreed that the case raised a justiciable question which it is for the courts to decide. This has several implications for the rule of law. At the most basic level, those of us charged with the responsibility of administering justice must do our utmost to ensure that our judgments convey our reasons in terms that are as accessible and transparent as they can reasonably be. But the much deeper concern is that without a dependable substratum of objective facts that most right-thinking people can agree on, it will be extremely difficult to engage in a sensible and rational debate. The decline of truth must surely be among the most pernicious threats against the sustenance of the rule of law, which, at its most basic level, must be rooted in the pursuit of truth in order to achieve justice. The Rule of Law Index in recent years may make for some disheartening reading, but this underscores the importance of the work that is being done by the World Justice Project. The task of rebuilding trust in the rule of law will require the coordinated and sustained efforts of a range of stakeholders, including the judiciary, the government, the legal profession, and the media. Benchmarks like the Rule of Law Index can help by affording us at least a sense of where we are, how far we have progressed or regressed as the case may be, and where we might consider intensifying our efforts. Let me conclude by commending the World Justice Project team once more for the tremendous work that they have put into the preparation of this year's Rule of Law Index, and thank them for their commitment to advancing justice and the rule of law in our world. Thank you very much for inviting me to address you.
Thank you, Chief Justice, for the keynote remarks and your kind words about the work of the World Justice Project and the Rule of Law Index. Now, to tell us more about the 2021 Rule of Law Index and what it shows about the rule of law in Asia Pacific, let me invite Dr. Alejandro Ponce, our Chief Research Officer and co-creator of the index. Alex, please.
Thank you very much, Gerard, and thank you. Hello, everyone. Let me introduce first my colleague, Alicia Evangelides. She's the co-director of the Rule of Law Index. She leads the data collection, analysis, presentation of the data. She leads the team in charge of doing that, and she's going to be joining us during the Q&A session. Thank you, Alicia. Let me start with the presentation. Next slide, please. The information that we're going to see today, as we heard, summarizes the views of 138,000 people around the world and more than 4,000 experts in 139 countries about their dealings with the government, the courts, the police, the openness or accountability of their governments, the perception about corruption, or the level of violence or crime to which they are generally exposed. All this information is organized around 8 factors that we have here, or dimensions. All of these dimensions essentially summarize the relationship between the state and citizens. These dimensions are constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice. Next. All of this information is further disaggregated into 44 sub-factors, which essentially summarize outcomes that rule of law societies want to achieve, organized around these dimensions. For example, when we talk about open government, we talk about publicized laws and government data, right to information, civic participation, and complaint mechanisms. These 44 sub-factors are further disaggregated into more than 500 variables. The data used to calculate these scores, or the scores that I'm going to present today, come from 2 data sources. One is, as I mentioned before, surveys to individuals in each one of the countries that we include in the index, 1,000 in each one of them, nationally representative samples, and surveys to practitioners living in each one of these countries, organized around 4 disciplines: civil justice, criminal justice, labor law, and public health. All this information is validated, collected, and summarized in the scores that I'm going to present today. Next slide. What is new about the Rule of Law Index 2021? This edition includes 139 countries and jurisdictions, includes the surveys of 138,000 households and more than 4,200 experts. This edition includes 11 new countries: Cyprus, Haiti, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Paraguay, Republic of Congo, Slovak Republic, and Sudan. The period of data collection, which was slightly delayed due to the pandemic, included from October 2020 to May 2021. As I mentioned before, 8 factors, 44 sub-factors, over 550 perception and experience-based questions. Next. The information is presented in the index in the form of country profiles, where you can review all the information at the country level. The information includes the scores, the rankings, regional rankings, income rankings, as well as changes over time, both in terms of ranks as well as in percentage terms, and the information for the sub-factors and which include comparisons with regional peers. Next slide. The information is available as well on the website, where you can see trends over time as well. You can check this in your phone. And there is also a booklet that we call the Insights booklet, which essentially summarizes the information that I'm going to present today and the global trends that I'm going to present in a moment. Next. Okay, next slide. First of all, overall, rule of law scores and rankings. The index, as I mentioned before, introduces the scores between 0 and 1. We present information that you can check where each one of the countries is positions with the change and the global rank, as well as the change in rankings. Next. Next. So to begin, before going into the levels of some of the changes that we have seen from the previous year, in this graph, you can see the biggest improvements and declines in rule of law scores per region. In the East Asia and Pacific region, Myanmar was the country that declined the most, with a decline of minus 6.3%. And the country that improved the most was Mongolia, with an improvement of 2%. Next. When we look at the rule of law and compare it to the situation of the previous year around the world, the picture, as we were hearing from the Chief Justice, is a picture of decline. Approximately 74% of the countries and jurisdictions experience a decline in their overall rule of law scores as compared to the previous year. In this chart, you can see the scores in the x-axis, the scores of rule of law, and the y-axis shows the changes, the percentage changes as compared to the previous year. As we can see, most countries actually showed a negative decline or a negative growth rate. And these growth rates actually happen throughout the spectrum of rule of law scores. The decline was slower or lower in the countries with more rule of law, but overall we see declines across the spectrum. Next. Something that we see as well is the changes over time. In this chart, you can see for each one of the countries in the index, the changes that they had experienced over the last 5 years. And the picture that we have here is that the declines have not only been recent, but in many cases they have been happening over the previous years. That's something that you will see in the scores, in the colors of yellow, orange, and red. Some countries have been experiencing declines, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Another feature is that sometimes countries experience sharp declines or sharp improvements from one year to the next. So the rule of law is not something that it's, I mean, in many cases, that it's something that can actually be volatile from sometimes from some years to the next, and it's something that we observe in a few countries. Next. This is the continuation of the table. Next. Now I'm going to summarize the main findings during the rule of law during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this essentially we can summarize them in three buckets, which has to do with rising authoritarianism, delays in justice, and rising discrimination. First, next. So first of all, over the previous year, we saw that approximately 70% of the countries and jurisdictions covered in the index show a decline in the factor called constraints on government powers. These factors essentially measures the constraints that the legislator may impose on the executive, constraints by the judiciary, independent audit and review institutions, electoral processes, or non-governmental checks such as a free press. In the majority of countries, we saw a decline from the previous year. In the case of Asia Pacific, two countries that declined, or countries that declined the most, were Myanmar with a decline of more than 13%, and Hong Kong, South China, with a decline of 6.3%. Next. Another finding related to the previous one is that last year we saw closing of the civic space. What you see in this graph is three of the indicators that we use to measure civic space, which is civic participation, freedom of opinion and expression, and freedom of assembly and association. In the three graphs are histograms of the percentage change over the previous year. So in the three cases, in the first case, participation, in the second case, freedom of opinion and expression, and in the third one, freedom of assembly and association, what we see is that most countries show negative declines as compared to the countries that show improvements. Those are the countries in red. In the map, what we saw are that most of the countries just had a decline in at least one of the categories. More than 80% of the countries decline in at least one of the categories, which speaks about this situation that I just mentioned. Next. Another feature that we see is delays in civil justice, criminal justice, and administrative justice during COVID-19. Just the three indicators that we have here are measures of delays. These are perception-based measures from the attorney's point of view in the different categories. But we have been asking several questions over the years, which allow us to compare these perceptions over years. And in both in civil justice, criminal justice, and administrative procedures, we see declines just over the years. Over overall, 4% of the countries experienced a decline in at least one of these categories over the previous year. Next. Third point is a rise in discrimination during last year. So approximately 67% of the countries covered in the index suffered declines in the scores of the sub-factors that measures equal treatment and absence of discrimination. And these measures perceptions of discrimination against people based on gender, socioeconomic status, race, sexual identity, etc. During the previous year in conditions such as the civil justice system, criminal justice system, workplaces, discrimination by the police, etc. This is something that we didn't have in the previous year that showed during this year. In the case of Asia Pacific, Thailand and Myanmar showed some of the biggest declines over the previous year. Next. Summarizing a little bit the information. So the weakening of institutions has occurred in a context of growing authoritarianism. So as we heard from the Chief Justice before, this is the fourth consecutive year in which more countries suffer declines in rule of law scores. This is true in the Asia Pacific region, it's true in the world, and it's true in the Asia Pacific region. The pandemic spread these trends and accelerated them in countries that were already experiencing declines. So what that means is more countries declined during the previous year, and for those countries that were indeed declining, the decline was larger during the previous year. Second point, as I mentioned before, justice delays occur in a context of limited access and lack of innovation. As we have heard before, there were studies show that a large number of people indeed cannot access the justice system, and whenever they have a problem, they do, in many cases, they do nothing, either because they don't know, they don't want to, they don't know how to access certain mechanisms, they don't have the information, they cannot afford assistance or representation. And it is in this context in which the pandemic hit, and as a result, we observed a lot of delays. At the same time, this can open a door for innovation, but this is something that we hope we can see in the following years. However, having said this, we didn't observe a negative trend as we were observing in the first element of growing authoritarianism. The last point is discrimination. So, and this is obviously, there are a lot of factors that can explain this. This is mainly a feature that we have seen during the previous year. There's no negative trend. And there are many reasons, just as we have heard. Inequality is probably related to this as well, and inequality in responses and impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have heard these stories, just that the COVID pandemic has hit in different ways, different populations, particularly has hit harder vulnerable populations, and the response in many cases around the world has not been equal. But also is partly due to some underlying structural factors, as we have seen, that may relate to, it could be to growing awareness of these issues, in part based on some of the developments over the previous year, but also just of underlying inequalities in many of these countries. Next. So now let me talk a little bit about some of the specific trends in Eastern Asia and the Pacific. Next. So these are the countries that are currently included in the index, and this is the position of the countries in the region. Just New Zealand at the top, followed by Australia, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Republic of Korea, Malaysia, Mongolia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, China, Philippines, Myanmar, and Cambodia. Some countries, as I mentioned before, the majority of countries experience declines in rule of law, even though you may say that not many countries, particularly the top change in rankings, still some countries experience declines, even though there were no change in the individual rankings, and this is something that we can see in this chart. Next. Here we can see just in more detail some of the changes that we saw in the previous graph. Here we're seeing the percentage change over the previous year, and there are really very few countries that experienced improvements. Mongolia, Japan, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, in many of these cases, the improvements were in all the different dimensions of the rule of law, but there are also just many countries that experienced declines, particularly some countries that we see at the bottom of the table: Thailand, Cambodia, Philippines, and Myanmar. In some cases, countries that have experienced declines over the previous years, sometimes steady declines and sometimes sharp declines in 1 year, and then stagnation in rule of law over the previous years. Next. And I'll conclude the presentation here. All the information is available on the website. You can see the QR code where you can access the information if you have your phone available, and we'll be happy to answer questions after the panel discussion. Back to you, Gerard.
Thank you, Alex, very much for giving us much food for thought about the state of the rule of law in the Asia-Pacific region. And I'm sure our audience out there has many questions. Let me remind viewers to put their questions in the comment section, and we will turn to them shortly. Now let me invite our distinguished panel of speakers who will help to shed some light about some of these issues today. Moderating the discussion, we have Simon Chesterman, the Law Dean, National University of Singapore, and the Board Director of the WJP Asia Pacific Singapore. We also have with us today in the studio in Singapore, Shreya Basu, Deputy Director and Regional Lead Asia Pacific Open Government Partnership. Over in the Philippines, we have John Neary. Hi, John. John is a columnist and editorial consultant at Rappler, the social news network in the Philippines. We also have Mo Tuzar, Fellow and Coordinator in Myanmar Studies Program at Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. And we also have Fu Hua Ling, Professor in Law, University of Hong Kong. And over to your good hands, Simon.
Thanks very much, Gerard, and it's great to be with all of you today. Good morning to those in Asia, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuning into this. There was a time when rule of law was controversial, where it was a dangerous thing to discuss at global forums, where it was controversial, it was seen sometimes as a Western import or a Western construct, and terms like good governance were sometimes used in opposition to it. But it's 15 years now since the United Nations unanimously agreed that the rule of law at the national and international level was a good thing. And it's more than a decade that the World Justice Project has been conducting its rule of law index. So I think it's much less controversial as a concept, but in practice it remains a problematic area. Now, academics love debating the meaning of the rule of law, but I think one of the things that the World Justice Project has achieved over this more than a decade of collecting data is showing that what the rule of law means in theory is less important than what it means in practice. And indeed, as the Chief Justice of Singapore said earlier this morning, the rule of law in practice has to be a living thing. It has to be something that people experience, people share in, and most importantly, people believe in. The way I sometimes fall back on this is to think of the rule of law a bit like oxygen, easily taken for granted, but noticed quickly in its absence. And indeed, its absence is one of the themes of this discussion, or at least its decline. As Betsy said at the opening of this session, the index is arguably going in the wrong direction. The Chief Justice said the rule of law is in retreat. I'm sure you will all have questions. You may have good comments to add. Please put them into the comments function, however you're tuning into this. But what I'm going to be doing today is inviting our speakers, if you like, to move from theory to practice, to move from this relatively abstract examination of the overall data to looking at 3 countries in particular, 3 countries and jurisdictions where the rule of law has faced particular challenges. And so we'll be looking at Hong Kong, Myanmar, the Philippines, and also bringing Shreya in to talk regionally what has been happening, but also what can be done. And indeed, one of the key takeaways, I think, from the Chief Justice's comments is that all of us have a stake in the rule of law and all of us have a role to play. So let me begin by calling on my old friend Fu Hua Ling, who's based in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been in the news for if you like, some of the wrong reasons over the past couple of years. And so, Hualing, can I ask you to start us off by moving, if you like, from theory to practice? What has been happening in the jurisdiction of Hong Kong, SAR? How is this experienced, and what's your reaction to this data? Does it reflect the reality in Hong Kong, or are we missing something?
Right. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for having me here. So when I first looked at the data, it was surprising to me, right? For good reasons. But then if you look at data comparatively and historically, it does make good sense. Let me tell you why. There are three surprises to me. First, the 2021 ranking for Hong Kong is the same as the ranking in 2022. Right? There's no change. We didn't move up, we didn't move down. Second, we are just told that 2021 was the fourth year in a row that more country jurisdictions declined rather than improved in the overall rule of law ranking. Hong Kong doesn't belong to that category. Right? We remain stable. That's the second. The third surprise is that if you look historically from 2015, our ranking has been very stable. Right? There's very little change for Hong Kong in the past 5 years. So how to explain the recent change introduced by the national security law and the quite widespread the critical press coverage internationally? Given the pandemic restrictions, people didn't really have the chance to visit us, so their perception of Hong Kong must be more or less depends on what they read, right? So that is my answer to it. Basically, there are basically three answers to it. First, if you look at the overall ranking for all the 8 factors, Hong Kong has been in steady but very slow-paced decline, right, since 2015 for most of the for all the factors. That's one. Second, you see the what's the term to use? The polarization or duality in the ranking. Hong Kong performs relatively strong and proves to be very resilient on the sort of a thin concept rule of law. So if you look at order and security, Hong Kong ranks very high, number 5 globally. Hong Kong ranks very high in the absence of corruption, in the regulatory enforcement. Hong Kong also ranks relatively well in civil justice, open government, and criminal justice. Hong Kong actually improved in open government. So I would categorize those factors as the thin dimension of the rule of law. But Hong Kong has been the damage or the weakness or the declining is the thick rule of law, right? In 2 items. One is constraining government power. Hong Kong scored 0.61, and also protection of fundamental rights. So in that sense, you see the overall stability, you see the resilience on the Hong Kong's legal system, you also see the vulnerabilities of Hong Kong's legal system. So in a way, I was looking at the Singapore's ranking. So in many ways, Hong Kong is moving steadily towards the Singaporean direction, if I may use the term. I will stop here. I'm happy to answer questions if there are many. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Hualing, and I will come back to you with questions, but just 2 takeaways from what you said. The first, where you ended up, you're exactly right, that there is a diversity in the index. It embraces different aspects of the rule of law. Alex was outlining the 8 different factors, and that is intended to recognize that the rule of law has different dimensions. You mentioned briefly the thick, the thin, and I think you're right that there are some jurisdictions, including Singapore, that rank very highly on some areas, less highly on others. The second thing that you pointed out is that really the consequence, one of the many consequences of the COVID pandemic, is that we're not visiting each other. And so Hong Kong, together with the rest of mainland China, remains much more locked down than many other jurisdictions. And so one interesting question will be whether that continued isolation reduces our capacity to understand, to have those exchanges that can raise confidence in rule of law across jurisdictions. Let me turn to Mo and Myanmar. Myanmar, in many ways, was meant to be on a very different trajectory. Over the past decade, there was enormous hope for Myanmar. In particular, between Singapore and Myanmar. I mean, I've gone to law schools in Myanmar to try and help map out legal education. There was a lot of optimism. That seems to have, if not completely disappeared, at least declined significantly over the past few years. Mo, can you tell us a bit about your reaction to the index and how Myanmar is represented in it this time around?
Thank you very much, Simon, and good morning to everyone connecting to the event from around the region and the globe. Good morning from Singapore. Simon, I mean, your observation really highlights the case, it puts the case of Myanmar into salience. I have noted the low score for Myanmar that has hovered close to the lower rungs of both the global and regional rankings since 2015, when I think the ranking then was showing some improvement. And it slipped even lower this year. Myanmar has become the country with the biggest decline in the region, and globally is also hovering in the lower rungs as well. So this overall low score for Myanmar, I think for me, confirms three hard truths, if I could use that phrase. And let me quickly share my three quick reactions or observations before going into those hard truths. So again, this year's findings. It's interesting. I understand that the collection of responses for this year's index spanned the final months of the National League for Democracy, the NLD government, and the first few months of the military coup on February the 1st that deposed the NLD government. So I think the findings could be interpreted as reflective of opinions and assessments by the respondents on both the NLD government and the State Administration Council military junta, as well as reflective of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's my first reaction. The second reaction is, because the collection of responses for Myanmar were ongoing at the time of the coup, it's clear that the coup has contributed to further deterioration of Myanmar's position in the index. All the actions of the State Administration Council, or SAC junta, since February the 1st show the extent of the Myanmar military's aspiration to be the country's legitimate executive. And the military has tried to use legal arguments. In this case, the military drafted 2008 constitution for its assumption of state power, and it has also used the law and order argument for the use of force. So my third quick reaction is the ranking for Myanmar's regulatory capacity seems to have remained relatively steady over the years of the NLD government and up to May this year after the military coup. Under the NLD, I think Myanmar scored close to or higher than the global average in enforcing government regulations effectively, without improper influence and unreasonable delay. So I think these were some of the considerations that had led voters across the country in November 2020, including in the ethnic nationality dominant areas, to choose the NLD again for a second term. But, it's also interesting to note here in that regulatory capacity that Myanmar has scored low in respecting due process and expropriation without lawful process and adequate compensation. So with these three quick reactions as a sort of a broad context, now for the hard truths. First, perceptions still persist in Myanmar that those in power can do anything. The NLD's supermajority in the 2015 elections raised hopes that the civilian elected government could start making changes to the entrenched role of the military in the country's political and economic spheres. But this supermajority also meant that lawmakers were more reluctant to be critical of the executive, while the military members of parliament, and by extension the military, which appoints these military members of parliament, they felt even more threatened and put even more on the defensive, as it were. Second hard truth. The judicial system has suffered the most in Myanmar since 1962. So people in Myanmar, formerly Burma, enjoyed, I would say, somewhat a predictable, impartial judiciary under colonial rule, and that was momentarily lost during the Japanese occupation in World War II. But I think the judiciary system tried to regain its effectiveness and independence in both the executive and legislative branches after it gained independence after Myanmar gained independence in 1948. And before the 1962 coup mounted by then Commander-in-Chief General Ne Win, he used the judiciary system to crush his opponents within the military, as well as activists who opposed his authoritarian rule. And this practice has continued after the 1988 coup, and the judicial system has not had a chance to recover. During that short decade of opening over 2010 to 2020, that was when you managed to visit Myanmar as well, Simon. And now that the judiciary system has been plunged back into being under the thumb of the authority of the day. And I'll end with my third hard truth. The military's concept of the rule of law is rule by law. And that law is one that they make or enforce via orders and directives, provided that they can give a legal explanation, however implausible that explanation might be. And this is how the junta today is also trying to justify or reconcile their illegal actions with the belief that they are actually upholding the rule of law. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mo, and really highlighting one of the challenges of rule of law is that when it starts to go in decline, when people stop believing in it, or when authorities start believing that they can do anything they want, it's very hard to reverse that perception that the rule of law has been replaced by rule by law, that the rule of law becomes an instrument of power as opposed to a check on power. Now, the reason why the World Justice Project collects this data is not simply to grade countries. Indeed, for the early years of the index, we resisted having a single ranking. It was meant to be a multiple set of data points that was meant to guide action, to enhance understanding. And so even though we do now have a ranking, the World Justice Project has continued to do work trying to help governments, civil society actors, in terms of improvements in the rule of law, better understanding their own jurisdictions and how they can learn from other jurisdictions. And indeed, Gerard here has done important work in the Philippines, and it's to the Philippines now that we turn. And John, so you're coming at this from a media angle, among other things. You're a columnist at the Philippine Daily Inquirer. Can you tell us a bit about your reaction to the ranking of the Philippines, but also how this information is useful for civil society, how it feeds into public discourse, and how hopefully it can militate for change, not from outside, but from empowering local actors to enhance their own understanding and activism and support for the rule of law. John.
Thank you, Simon. I'm no longer with the Philippine Daily Inquirer. I've moved to Rappler with Maria Ressa. Let me follow my co-panelists and also offer three quick reactions to the 2021 Rule of Law Index. And I hope to answer your question at the end, Simon. So my first quick reaction is that the closing of civic space, which Alex pointed to, also happened in the Philippines in all three dimensions: civic participation, freedom of opinion, and freedom of assembly and association. The Philippines saw a decline in the 2021 index. The possible reason for this, I think, is that in the pandemic, the Duterte administration approached the worst health emergency we've ever faced as a public security problem instead of a public health problem. And I think that explains why we had these declines in all three dimensions. The second thing I'd like to bring up has to do with a comparative perspective. we are the worst in the region. So if you will take a look at the next slide, in the very promise that Duterte made at the start of his brutal regime, order and security. So in 2021, we are 15th out of 15 countries in the Asia Pacific in effective control of crime, and 14 out of 15 in effective limiting of civil conflict, next only to Myanmar, which is now suffering, of course, civil strife. So comparatively speaking, we are at the very bottom. The third thing that I'd like to bring up, I have a couple of slides for this, has to do with foregoing the comparative perspective and just looking at what the country has done or has failed to do. So we are, in fact, we have worsened in two very important factors. In criminal justice, we're in the red zone in 4 of the 7 sub-factors. Again, these are promises, these are pillars of the Duterte regime, and yet we have fared the worst. And then the last slide, please. What is even worse is that in fundamental rights, we are also in the red zone. And the right to life, that's where our worst showing is. So we have deteriorated from an already terrible 0.18 last year to 0.17 this year. This is ironic because, and this is part of the answer to your question, Simon, the Philippine government itself has already incorporated the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index into its development plan. So the Philippine Development Plan under Duterte has 3 indicators using Rule of Law Index numbers. And unfortunately, they are the 3 where we've fared the worst. Well, 2 of the 3 where we've fared the worst. Fundamental rights, criminal justice, and civil justice. So the Philippine government itself has used the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index as a measure. And they use it in terms of where we are in the global standings. So the idea was that by the end of the term, the Philippines would be in the top 20% of countries as far as criminal justice is concerned, top 25% as far as civil justice is concerned, and top 25% as far as fundamental rights is concerned. But I think I haven't crunched the numbers, but I think we are in the exact end of the list, 5 years into the Duterte regime. How has this fed discourse? So first, it's in the actual government plan, but I think that it also confirms what our own local surveys have shown. A majority of Filipinos now think that it is dangerous for the media to publish anything critical of the Duterte regime. This particular survey result came out after the shutdown of the country's largest TV network. But I think that if this was the same period in which the experts were consulted for that side of the survey, I think then we can see why it's reflected in the civic space numbers for the Philippines. Many Filipinos will say that they support Duterte's flagship program, the so-called war on drugs. And yet, consistently, over the last 4 or 5 years, people say, 3/4 of survey respondents say that they think that they or someone they know will be the next victim of an extrajudicial killing. I mean, that's just an astonishing finding, and it's repeated every year. So they say we support the president, we think he's doing well, there's less crime, and yet 3/4 of Filipinos say, well, we might be the next victim of an extrajudicial killing. And I think that helps explain why our numbers are this low.
Thanks, John. So more, I suppose, sobering, I'll say sobering rather than depressing analysis, but also highlighting, I think, this larger context of the move towards authoritarianism that we've seen in many jurisdictions, and the Philippines, a prime example among them, perhaps. So the question that comes out of this, of course, is what is to be done? What can we do with this data? How can we use it? And in particular, even as we support and follow closely the activists and indeed the governments within the various jurisdictions, is there a regional way in which we can address this? What can people do from the outside? And so, Shreya, I'm going to turn to you in your capacity as one of the heads in the Open Government Partnership. What can we do from the outside, and indeed what is the Open Government Partnership doing to improve respect for and the implementation of the rule of law regionally and in these various jurisdictions?
Great. Thank you for that, Simon. Let me take a moment to first congratulate the World Justice Project on the launch of the index, and to Gerard for this Asia-Pacific launch. And as you said, the findings have been sobering. It is something that we have seen across the Open Government Partnership, our members across the world, 78 countries, and more so in this region. Just for our listeners, the Open Government Partnership's mission is really to bring reformers, both within government and outside, from civil society, the private sector, academia, and other sectors, together to identify very concrete actions or reform commitments that they can make, locked into a biennial 2-year action plan, implemented, again, in a collaborative approach between government and civil society, but also independently monitored. We were launched about a decade ago. And in the decades since our launch, we saw some important strides being made in areas that the index covers around government constraints on power, around anti-corruption, less so on civic space. But sadly, as the pandemic broke out and unfolded, we've seen many of those early gains being reversed. And I think part of that has been because just the lack, there has been very limited understanding of what proportionality measures need to apply to restrictions on freedom of information, on freedom of assembly, association, many of the other areas covered by the index. And of course, it's also laid bare some of the inequities that have always existed structurally, both in this part of the world as well as outside. This is something that we've seen within OGP's own data as well. So let me tell you what resonates within the findings, and then move to what the OGP has been doing about this, particularly in recent years. The index findings around civic space, of course, concern us because the entire sense of our partnership relies on civil society being able to mobilize, be able to organize, and be able to represent the voice of citizens as they negotiate with government to identify which reforms to undertake as part of these biennial plans. And we know that even amongst Open Government Partnership members, so countries that are, supposedly on this journey towards opening up, there have been very few commitments or real action being taken in these areas in terms of policy measures, be it on civic space, but also importantly in areas on applying government constraints on power. At the same time, what our data is showing is that where you have meaningful civil society engagement, you see greater ambition in reforms, you see better implementation, you see stronger early results. So there's a very strong case to be made for investing in this area. And finally, interestingly, I think what it's also showing, I think, for the index for us, something that OGP has been advocating for and sort of, has been putting forth in recent years is the pervasive corruption, the absence or the decline of civic space, these don't matter just because of them being normative public goods. You're actually seeing these create conditions where the rule of law can be applied unevenly. So this is actually leading to active discrimination, exclusion. So at the Open Government Partnership, our mission has always been to get different actors, reformers, as I said earlier, to come together and identify concrete things that can be done. And in this regard, the index provides good data in the hands of activists and reformers to identify which areas need action. Since the pandemic broke out, we launched a campaign, the Open Response, Open Recovery, and now Open Renewal in some societies which are lucky enough to talk about renewal by now, which we know many countries in this region are still very far off from. With the belief that open government can be central to a just recovery, but only if we move away from open government being seen as information disclosure for disclosure's sake only. I think the Chief Justice earlier mentioned we are living in an age where there's been more information available than before. But to also couple that with concrete actions that allow for public participation, that allow for public accountability, as well as inclusion in the kinds of reforms that countries are undertaking. So around rule of justice, the law, rule of law and justice, 3 specific areas of action that we're calling for all member countries to show progress on. One is improving access to justice, so every citizen knows where to go to for help and has access to be able to maneuver a system that offers procedural, substantive, as well as expeditious justice. We've seen Indonesia, which is an OGP member country, not faring very well on the index, of course, make some important commitments in their last Open Government National Action Plan, both around ensuring that people with disabilities are accommodated through every process, every stage of the judicial process, but also in expanding legal aid services, opening up a portal that will allow people to have much more real-time information on the kinds of services they can access, as well as training legal aid providers on handling the provision of services to marginalized communities. The second area of action that we're calling on countries to take is around opening up justice sector institutions themselves. So ensuring that judicial proceedings, the appointments of courts, court justices, these are all areas that the public has an ability to exercise oversight over. Not much in this region, sadly, yet. Specifically amongst OGP member countries, but we are seeing some good examples from the Americas. Colombia comes to mind, and not a country I know that we normally associate with a lot of open government initiatives, but we're seeing some exciting reforms around where citizens can monitor the election of magistrates, as well as sort of provide mechanisms to gain access to grievance redressal more expeditiously than before. And then the third area, because sadly there's going to be no silver bullet reform for the breadth of issues that this index covers, is really ensuring that laws are both adopted and then credibly implemented that relate to freedom of information around anti-corruption, beneficial ownership of companies, for example, so that the system can be less captured by vested interests, because the intersections between open justice and open government, I think, are quite strong. So here again, we are asking countries to take action. And a good example here comes from, again, surprisingly, Nigeria, where we've seen the Ministry of Justice, introduce efforts to ensure that the freedom of information requests are processed, despite some of the closures that the pandemic has introduced. OGP's model of getting countries to take action in this, of course, relies on peer exchange, inspiration. We've just recently launched an OGP, a coalition of justice, where we work with a lot of partners that have been providing technical expertise in this region, that have deep experience and expertise, work alongside governments to showcase what leadership could look like, and then use that to inspire others. South Korea, which is currently the co-chair of the Open Government Partnership, the lead co-chair of the Open Government Partnership, has also issued a call to action asking all member countries to take action on issues around anti-corruption, civic space, so again, related issues that are covered in the index. And our role at the Secretariat is to really be able to get the peers to talk to each other, mobilize expertise through the vast network that we have, and spotlight what's working well. So we'd love to learn from the movers that have gone in the right direction in the index, even as the overall index, as you said, Simon, has gone in the wrong direction, to inspire action amongst the others.
Thank you very much, Shreya. And I was kind of hoping you might have a silver bullet. You didn't have a silver bullet, but you did have some good news, although sadly a lot of it came from outside of our region. Can I bring in Alicia? One of the fascinating things for you must be, having spent all this time collecting the data, now you get to see how it's being used, how it's being interpreted. I'm curious your reaction to this discussion, in particular, John's observation that the Philippines has explicitly embraced the data, embraced it as a target, and gone in exactly the opposite direction. So, Alicia, your kind of response to this set of observations from our part of the world.
Thank you so much, Simon. Can you all hear me okay?
We can indeed.
Great. Well, thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you for the great discussion so far. And again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. We'd be happy to answer them. I think it's been really wonderful hearing reflections on how the data may and may not reflect the actual the reality in each of these countries. We know that the index has both strengths and weaknesses, and so that it can highlight some of the ways in which a country might be performing either well or not as well, and there may be some things that it misses at times. So it's great to hear some of these reflections and some of these thoughts. And we do always urge people to use the index in conjunction with other tools and resources that there might be out there to measure rule of law in any given country. So I think I would just say that, and thank you for all of the observations. And we encourage you to keep using the index, providing that feedback, and to be using it in conjunction with a number of other resources that are out there that can measure these difficult to measure topics.
Thanks so much, Alicia. So let me go back to each of our speakers just with one question from me, and then we'll take some of the questions that have been coming in through the comments function. And Hua Ling, I'll come back to you if I may. So one of the things that you highlighted was the diversity of the aspects of the rule of law within Hong Kong. Clearly, Hong Kong is a sophisticated jurisdiction. You've got access to the information. I suppose on this question of the role...
Hong Kong and in Beijing, I think they care probably too much about the ranking in particular, especially the ranking is not well. In Hong Kong, I think the government is looking for sometimes well, you may say a positive spin of what is happening. If you look at the scoring in Hong Kong, you can always focus on the scores in which Hong Kong did well. I mean, we are doing well: anti-corruption, good governance, law and order. Right. Then the issue is how to address the issue where we were not doing well. So that will be the challenging question. I think it's nice to highlight the strength, highlight the resilience, but also point out the vulnerabilities, and that is the area we could to have the concentrated efforts. Otherwise, you will give just a very general, vague critique of Hong Kong's rule of law. So armed with the data sets, we could make a very nuanced argument. I think it makes more sense to the wider audience. In a divided society, we need nuanced data to start a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mo, can I put the same question to you? I suspect I know the answer, but do the authorities in Myanmar care about this kind of data, this kind of representation of Myanmar? And maybe just following up, if not, what can we do from the outside to support the development of civil society, getting Myanmar back on that positive track? I realize that would be a topic to launch an entire conference, but just your brief response to whether the authorities are paying attention to this and what, if anything, we might do differently from the outside.
Thank you, Simon. Interestingly, the military regime, the State Administration Council, is very sensitive to how it is, to its, quote unquote image, how it is perceived, how people are talking about it. And of course, this is related to the very focused interest to assert itself as the sole legitimate representative of Myanmar, such as we have seen in the recent ASEAN summits that are concluding today. So here, I guess my quick answer would be yes, they care and they don't care, in the sense that they care about rankings. They care about how people are talking about Myanmar, and particularly the regime. They've even told media not to use the word junta or regime when writing about the regime. So anyway, because they do monitor all of these, they do monitor anything that's been discussed about Myanmar under the SAC junta. They will take this into account. But will they then try to effect changes? My quick assessment is no. They'll just try to use their same old arguments and insist upon their way of doing things as the way that they are proceeding with respecting the rule of law or implementing the rule of law. maybe I'll leave it at that. How we can bring about change, how to, I think, further work with and empower, enable civil society is something that, sadly, it's not possible right now when the situation in the country is still one where there's still violent clashes going on and views are so polarized, where civil society groups are also trying to keep a very low profile, or those who might attract attention of the military have tried to move into safe zones or liberated areas across the border, along the Thai-Myanmar border. So we still have to look at how the ASEAN process manages to try and bring about a constructive outcome for that recovery and renewal further down the line that Shreya has talked about. So I think that's how things stand. Simon, you talked about rule of law being like oxygen, that people can take it for granted and miss it only when it's not there. I think right now, sadly, for people in Myanmar, we haven't been able to breathe properly all these years.
Thank you. So John, you highlighted that at least the data is on the agenda in the Philippines, even if it isn't necessarily changing policy. Can I ask you a slightly different question? So it appears that President Duterte is not going to be continuing his role. He's at least said he's going to step down. There's going to be an alternative leadership. Do you think that will make a difference? What do you think it would take to turn around this perception of the rule of law in the Philippines? Will that change in leadership have a big impact, or will it take more than that to reverse this current trajectory that the Philippines has been in decline? What would it take to turn the ship around, if you like?
I think the answer there is a clear yes. If there's another president other than Duterte, there will be a turnaround in the country's performance in the rule of law index. And why is that? Because for the Duterte administration, they have a different definition of strong institutions. So, for instance, we have a new anti-terrorism act. And it's been assailed for being overbroad, for being unconstitutional. And I'm sure it had an impact on the experts who were consulted, who were surveyed for the index. But for them, it's the right move. It's the right decision. In the same case, the application of the overbroad cyber libel law also, which has put a chill in journalism circles. That's a matter of policy. So if you remove the government that has that policy, I think we will see maybe not immediately, but we will see an improvement in our rule of law performance.
Okay, well, fingers crossed on that front. We're almost out of time. I'm going to ask Gerard just to summarize the kind of questions that have been coming in and then give our panelists in reverse order, starting with Shreya, a chance to respond and make any very, very final comments in 30 seconds or so.
Sure. Thank you, Simon. Thank you so much for all the comments that are being posted here. A common thread that I see in the questions and the comments is, this is a situation that we have, but what can we do to make it better? A number of countries have slipped in Asia-Pacific in the rankings, but there are also so-called winners, as it were. Are there any particular lessons that we can learn from these countries to improve? Yeah, that's a common call that I keep hearing from the comments. What can we do better moving forward?
So people wanting good news, people wanting ideas for action. 30 seconds or less. Going in reverse order, Shreya, first with you, please.
Yeah, I mean, easier said than done, right? But like I said earlier, I think the most powerful thing we can do in a moment like this is to equip the reformers within the system, strengthen their hand, find ways to connect them to each other, but also importantly, ensure they have resources at their disposal. So I think also lessons there for, at the national level, local philanthropists. Especially as we see $8 sort of declining coming into this region as more countries move into middle income status, supposedly, and being able to take care of their own needs, but also for development partners in this region, ensuring that, that they do not become co-opted within the narratives that we hear around, governments use to defend the declines that we are seeing, but really ensure that civil society is empowered, reformers empowered to be able to use their voice and have the resources. Nothing's free. so to ensure that this important work is resourced.
Thank you very much. John, any last comments or reactions to that, that desire for good news and for action?
That's right. What can we do? From the Philippines, I think at least a couple of things. One is we need to work more closely with the international community, put pressure from outside. But second, I think we also need to focus on improving the administration of justice. I speak in particular of strengthening or reinforcing support for our trial court judges. In the last year or so, there were several very important rulings at the level of trial courts, not at the level of a Supreme Court, that actually made an impact on the civic space. So if we can find means to support these judges, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, and a good reminder that rule of law isn't just what happens at the top. Rule of law is what's lived, the lived experience across society. Mo, any last comments from you, please?
Simon, because if we wish to inform or influence future policy agendas, I mean, how do we identify ways, means, and channels to get through to the military regime right now? I mean, there is the ASEAN process that is trying to focus on seizing the violence, getting all the key stakeholders to engage in a constructive dialogue, and then really try to get back to that democratic transition path. But these are all longer-term prospects. So if we want to identify ways and means to get the forces for democracy, those who are moving for change, those who are resisting the coup currently, then we'll probably need to look at how to get, say, the parallel national unity government informed of such findings and what the implications are. They have come up with quite a few progressive policies with regard to inclusion of the Rohingya communities, with regard to responsible business investment. So if those elected lawmakers denied their chance to take up the mantle of the legislature, if they can, I think, be given the chance to understand the implications and prepare for the future, that would be one venue. Capacity building now, again, is a bit of a gray area for Myanmar in terms of how the world is, viewing engagement with the military regime. Otherwise, of course, as you also have seen and experienced, really starting to build up that capacity from the ground up across different disciplines and the civil society, I think would have been a great way, as it was during that decade of opening up. Thank you.
Thanks, Mo. Okay, Hua Ling, last comments from you.
Right. For us, we are a small jurisdiction, highly international. So I think the first thing is to stop the pandemic, open the borders, and resume life as we know it. That is the first thing to do.
Well, I think from your lips to God's ears, from many of us, I suspect. So let me conclude by thanking our panelists, Fu Hualing, Mo Tuzar, John Neri, Shreya Basu. Thank you very much to Alex for the wonderful presentation of the data that you've collected, and to Alicia for your important role in collecting it. The reason we gather this data, of course, is not to judge. The origin of the index goes back to an old management edict that it's very hard to improve what you can't measure. And so we're measuring this not to criticize, we're measuring to try and help improvement. So thank you to all our panelists, thank you to all of you for listening in, and I'll pass back to Gerard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you to the panel, the viewers, for all the great questions. Now let me invite Ted McCone, the WJP's Chief Engagement Officer, who I believe is who is currently in New York, to conclude our proceedings. Over to you, Ted.
Thank you, Gerard, and greetings, everyone. Congratulations for such a fascinating discussion and really illuminating the many challenges we face. I mean, I think the important point of this independent data that we collect from people on the ground in these countries is to not only diagnose problems, but to really help set priorities for change. And I think we began hearing about some of those solutions, looking forward for how we can strengthen the rule of law based on evidence of where the main problems lie. We have a lot of work to do. The World Justice Project also seeks to identify solutions very much in the spirit of what we've been talking about today. We have a World Justice Challenge, which we have just launched the new edition this week, and we hope you all take a look. The World Justice Challenge is a global competition to identify best practices and innovative solutions to rule of law problems around the world. Our three themes going into this next round are how to address access to justice, corruption and open government, and equal rights and non-discrimination. There'll be a set of cash awards for the most impactful projects as determined by a panel of esteemed judges. And we will announce the winners at our next World Justice Forum, which will take place May 30th to June 2nd next year in The Hague and online for the first time. So we invite you all to take a look at the forum and hope that you can join us there. There'll be more details coming out in the middle of November. In addition to thanking all of you and our great panelists tonight and Simon for moderating, I want to send a very special thank you to Gerard Vinluan, who has been with World Justice Project for these last 5 years, getting us up and running in Singapore and the Asia Pacific region, and has contributed so much to the work that we have done. Gerard is about to take a big step forward in his own professional career, and so I hope you will join me in sending him off with a hearty applause for his creative energy and his great networking and diplomatic skills, and we wish him all the great luck in the days and years ahead. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you to Gerard.